Yeah, go.
Okay, I'm going to hit the button and you are live.
All right. Hello, everyone. How are you? Sorry for the delay. We had some technical difficulties in going live, but we are here now. And so, welcome to Hispanic Heritage Month event. I am Professor Mehmet Küçüközer, Professor of Sociology and Chair of Hispanic Heritage Month. And it is my pleasure, and of course, we are very lucky to have tonight Daicy Diaz-Granado, who is a doctoral candidate in urban education at the City University of New York Graduate Center. And she very graciously has come to share some of the research that she's doing, important research that she's doing. The title of her talk is Puerto Ricans in the Diaspora in Search of Liberating Educational Experiences and a Home. And she'll speak extensively of some of this research and her findings. Daisy, please take it away.
Okay, thanks everybody. I'm really happy to be here with you all tonight. And thank you for waiting. Thank you for hanging in there with us as we work some things out. I don't know to what extent this will work, but I wanted to do a little check-in to see, get an idea of who all is joining us tonight. And my check-in is we're getting together for Hispanic Heritage Month. And I was wanting to know if you can participate a little and let us know why you're here, why we're here, and what should we recognize and how should we commemorate Hispanic Heritage Month, if anybody wanted to participate and weigh in on that. Basically, what are your expectations? And then just more broadly, what can we do? What should we be doing to celebrate and commemorate Hispanic Heritage Month?
Okay, I'm not getting any comments yet, but hopefully people will start to type in if they about their views or what they expect from Hispanic Heritage Month.
Mm-hmm. Okay, it is, please feel free to put in your comments as we go along, and the professor will let me know when I can, we'll pause and we'll answer any questions as they come up, and we can just, play this by ear. I'm gonna share with you a little bit of the research that I'm presently working on. And it's in the form of stories. So I'm going to tell a pretty long story, but please feel free to put in any questions that you might have, and we can stop while we can take pauses and kind of address any kind of questions that come up. And so I'll begin. So as Professor Kozer.
Mehmet is fine. Mehmet is fine.
Mehmet. So as Mehmet said, I am a doctoral candidate. I'm working on my PhD right now. I'm writing my dissertation. And it is a special kind of hell, but I want to tell you all, I want to put out a plug for the Graduate Center. I'm doing a program in urban education at the Graduate Center, which is CUNY's Graduate Center. And it's a wonderful place. They have amazing programs. So, I wholeheartdy recommend the Graduate Center for PhDs. I'm on a fellowship, so I get a actual paid PhD. And I've just received an award to write my dissertation. So I got the Randolph Hearst Award. So I got $25,000 so I could stay home a little bit. So there's tons of support at the Graduate Center. If you have any aspirations or any desires to want to continue, there's my plug. It's a great place. Okay, so I focus on urban education, and the reason why I'm doing a PhD in urban education is because I've been an educator for 25 years. I'm presently a high school teacher, and I taught middle school for 6 years. I taught middle school in New York in a bilingual middle school, and now I'm teaching social studies in high school. And I'll answer the question that I asked you to begin with. Why am I here, and what should we recognize in Hispanic heritage? I have to tell you that when I realized that I was speaking at Hispanic Heritage Month, I was like, okay, it's our month, right? That's right. And mixed feelings about it, and just thankful to have this space so that we can get to know each other. And my topic today is going to be circular migration, and I'll explain how Puerto Ricans come back and forth, because as American citizens, we can come back and forth between the island and the mainland. But more broadly speaking, and answering the question about Hispanic heritage, I think that it gives us an opportunity to talk and get to know each other. It gives us space to have conversations that we want to have about things that we want to identify. And so I'm going to talk about circular migration. And migration is really a big topic when we talk about immigration. I work with the CUNY initiative on immigrant education, CUNY-I, and we do a lot of work to help teachers, to support them, to support immigrant origin students and immigrant families that are in our classrooms. So, so broader theme, immigration, and just being able to talk and relate to each other as human beings, whether we're Hispanic or not. But I'm going to focus on the Puerto Rican experience because that's what my dissertation is. My project was an oral history project. I interviewed Puerto Rican millennials. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. So what I want to share with you today is some of the work that I'm presently doing for my dissertation, which is an oral history project where I interviewed Puerto Rican millennials about their experience. As an educator, my original goal was to delineate the conditions under which Puerto Rican students in the diaspora have had liberatory educational experiences. So that is what I was looking for. When, where, how do we have liberatory or agentic educational experiences? Participants did share about liberation, but they explained that we need to look at oppression. So so my question was, where have we had liberatory educational experiences? And they were like, what do you mean by liberation? And I was like, good question. What do we mean by liberation? And so my participants said that we needed to look at oppression to see what it is exactly that is binding and oppressing us so that we can understand how we can break free. They believed that we needed to talk about the oppression and trauma that they had experienced, which I tell you, I really struggled with that because when I joined the academy, I said, I am not going to stir up any Puerto Rican trauma porn. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to just be scholarly. And I've struggled with that. But I struggled with it, but I wanted to showcase liberation and agency. But my participant stories described liberation through pain or from trauma. And so I honor that. And so I amplify those stories. So for my presentation, I will describe my project a little bit. I'll share with you a little bit of history about Puerto Rico and describe current events to provide context, and also share the life story of one of my research participants who highlighted the trauma and the difficulties they faced as a colonial subject trying to make a home in the United States, and ultimately how they experienced a liberatory education in an unlikely place. The story that I am sharing with you all is about making a home, a theme that emerged in my research, which is complicated because of the particularities of Puerto Rican circular migration. As US citizens, Puerto Ricans can migrate back and forth freely, and they often do. My oral history project interrogated many complexities of the Puerto Rican experience. So for this presentation, my focus is on the difficulty of making a home in the diaspora. And as I alluded to, it's something that many people, Hispanic, people across the globe are struggling with. They're being displaced. And so this struggle of making a home, and then in particular, making a home in the diaspora. I want to note up front that I do not mean to generalize or essentialize the experience of Puerto Ricans, and that while I may focus today is on the struggles of the people that I share their stories, I can also share endless accounts of the resilience, agency, and success of many Puerto Ricans, many Puerto Ricans, both on the island and in the diaspora. So actually, let me start sharing my slides.
Daisy, while you're doing that, Samantha Cruz, a student at our college, writes that one aspect of her interest in Puerto Rico is Bad Bunny. I know you wanted to share something from Bad Bunny, so
thank you.
So hopefully,
if we're not talking about Bad Bunny, what are we doing? We will talk about Bad Bunny.
And Craig Stokes, one of the professors, also congratulated you on your being a recipient of of the fellowship that you mentioned earlier.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. The mural here, so this is it's Puerto Ricans in the Diaspora in Search of Liberatory Educational Experiences. And then my focus today is going to be on finding a home. And this mural on this first slide figures prominently in the story that I'm going to tell you. And I'll tell you how that happens a little bit later. So I guess now I just want to jump into a little bit of history to provide a little bit of context. And we all have, background information, but just, if you'll indulge me, I just want to cover a few basics so that we all are on the same page. Understanding the history of Puerto Rico as a colony of the United States is very important for my project on many levels. So I begin by noting that Puerto Ricans have been relegated to a second-class citizenship status, which has had devastating consequences, some of which are revealed by my participants. The colonial subjugation of Puerto Rico by the US was accomplished swiftly when the island was transitioned from Spanish imperial rule to American imperial rule after the Spanish-American War in 1898. In 1900, US President McKinley signed the Foraker Act that established a new governing structure in Puerto Rico. The first civil governor appointed by the US under the Foraker Act was Charles H. Allen. This robber baron moved quickly to exploit his powerful position in the new colony by raising taxes and withholding loans and financing for agriculture, education, and infrastructure. Allen instead worked to divert funds to pay top salaries for new American bureaucrats imported to form part of Allen's ruling elite and create the American Sugar Refining Company. This new ruling elite would focus on awarding lucrative contracts on the mainland to US businessmen, and by 1930, Allen and US banking interests had converted 45% of all suitable land in Puerto Rico into sugar plantations. And with less available land for agriculture, the Puerto Rican standard of living declined steadily. In summary, Puerto Ricans were dispossessed of their lands as exploitive American investors enriched themselves, a pattern that continues to this day. By the mid-20th century, Puerto Ricans fled crushing poverty under colonial rule and emigrated en masse to the US. Lured by the promise of the American dream, they were instead racialized, ghettoized, and restricted from access to said dream. Marginalization and segregation in housing, work opportunities, and educational systems relegated Puerto Ricans to an intergenerational second-class status and blocked them from inhabiting positions of power. Consigned to a low-rung status in the American social and economic sphere, their identities and language were racialized by scholars, the media, and educational systems. It is this colonial oppression that has resulted in trauma, poverty, lack of access to education, healthcare, and housing, and that is directly responsible for the problems that my participants face, which I highlight here today. To be clear, my participants tell stories that result directly from being oppressed and marginalized. Most notable and pertinent to my presentation today, the participants describe difficulty as they endeavor to find stability, and many experiencing circulatory migration between the mainland and the island in search of a place to call home. Today, I highlight a poignant vignette of one of my participants' struggle to find a home, which showcases the resiliency and power of the individuals who dare to dream and shape their own spaces of belonging in the diaspora. I am a Puerto Rican woman who was born to parents who immigrated from Puerto Rico in the early 1950s. I was born and raised in the United States, and I see myself as part of what became the Puerto Rican and what is the Puerto Rican diaspora. My parents joined a wave of Puerto Ricans who immigrated to the mainland, lured by affordable housing, cheap airline tickets, and a concerted push by the Puerto Rican government and American business owners. In 1947, the Puerto Rican government passed Law 25, the Puerto Rican immigration law, which delineated that as US citizens, Puerto Ricans had a right to migrate to the mainland. So there was a big push, a big concerted push. My parents considered themselves lucky to join their relatives in New York City to pursue a better life for themselves and for their children. But for many, a better life would not materialize. So this is a picture of my mom. My mom is in the back eating something, and my aunt is in the foreground, and they are bad women. They are just so awesome. And they are at the Puerto Rican Day Parade circa 1970s. And then the little pictures on the bottom right is my son. I think that was outside our kitchen. And that's my daughter in Puerto Rico and in Morro, the fort. And of course, if you know anything about Puerto Ricans, we're always waving our flag. So I am no different. And here's the evidence. Yeah.
You mentioned something interesting in your talk about the law that spoke about the rights of Puerto Ricans to migrate to the mainland. You
Yeah.
said 1945.
In 19, so Puerto Ricans are citizens, and in actuality and in law, we can migrate. But then there's a concerted effort by Luis Muñoz Marin in 1947, and so they passed the law just to kind of give it a little bit more vigor.
It was more symbolic, because I was curious about that. Why, they weren't allowed to migrate before that?
No, the great thing about my project is that I get to interview people today, but it's an oral history, and I also do a lot of historicizing. And so I look at the totality of migration of Puerto Ricans, and there were Puerto Ricans coming in the 19th century, the late 19th century. There were a lot of exiles, Cubans particularly, and Puerto Ricans were living here. And then in the turn of the century, that's the end of the 19th century. And as the colony changes hands from Spain to America, there's quite a few. There are early migrants coming, and they come they come easily. And I want to say when we're declared citizens, there's a series of Supreme Court rulings that define what kind of citizenship we have. So that is very tricky. But the ability to come back and forth once we become American citizens, there's no planes, and it's difficult. So there were a lot of people coming via ship, and they were granted access as citizens. But it's a tricky question, because the extent of the shape of what our citizenship looks like, and even today, Puerto Ricans are colonial subjects, right? They don't have representation in Congress. They don't have, for example, if you want to apply for SSI benefits, you cannot get those benefits. The Supreme Court just ruled a few months ago that Puerto Ricans cannot get SSI benefits on the island. And then we look at the treatment after the hurricanes, and we know what the status of but legally and in practice, that's a complicated question. It would seem straightforward, but we do not have the same rights and privileges as citizens in other states in a lot of ways.
And then the other factors, I think perhaps what facilitated the ability for Puerto Ricans to move was did they set up an infrastructure of travel and movement for Puerto Ricans to be able to migrate? That's another question.
So much. And so the law that says, just so that there's clarity, and the law is passed by the Puerto Rican government, right? By the Puerto Rican Senate, just to lay the law of the land locally, that people do have the right to go. And there's a lot of work and collaboration with the US government to facilitate. And I can even tell you that I remember that the Puerto Rican government creates the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which is an organization and in New York. So Puerto Ricans come to New York, they come to Chicago, they come to Boston. And I remember in New York that it was a Puerto Rican government office, and it was situated in these the one in New York was in downtown and around Delancey Street. And the Commonwealth helped Puerto Ricans, assimilate. And they did things like, I got my first summer job through the Puerto Rican Commonwealth. And so, yeah, there's a lot of facilitating, both by the Puerto Rican government and by the American government, because they wanted to move the surplus population off the island so that they could modernize Puerto Rico, because now it's post World War II, and the island becomes a showcase of American democracy as the Cold War is getting underway. So it's very important for optics that the island is modernized. And so there's a close collaboration between the government on the island and the American government. And so that means Puerto Ricans need to go, and they need to go quick. So there's a big push off the island. Yeah. Okay. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about doing oral histories. And I'm using an oral history methodology, which is allowing me to amplify the voices of Puerto Rican millennials to make meaning around the ways that the Puerto Ricans have sought to make a home in the diaspora. And I hope that you will bear with me today, because I want to amplify their voices. And so I'll share a lot of their actual words from our interviews, if you will allow me. This is a picture of me conducting an autoethnographic oral history, which included intergenerational interviews with family members, including my mom and my aunt, who are pictured here. So many years after that day, that nice hot summer day in June in the 1970s. This was last year, going on 2 years now. In November, it'll be 2 years that I did this oral history with them, sat around the kitchen table, which is where we share our oral histories, where we tell our stories and where, you know, we inform ourselves about who we are. And so I got to sit down with them and listen to their stories again, you know, because I've heard them so many times, but this time I had a different lens and I was listening with a different ear. And it helped me to think about and prepare for this oral history project. I'm using oral histories to explore the experiences of Puerto Ricans in conjunction with using what scholar Michelle Fine identifies as a critical bifocality, to analyze how the salient events identified by my respondents are in conversation with the different reforms and policies and historical context like we were just discussing. And so that's the background history. How do my participants' stories connect with those policies, those discourses, that history, that back history, and then, you know, as the other history as it has evolved and is evolving. We need that critical bifocality to hold space and understand the significance of the stories about circular migration and a search for home. This is a photo of that great migration of Puerto Ricans that we're talking about to the mainland. And this group, this is in the 1950s or so, 1960s, and this group has just arrived at Newark Airport. And as you can see, they have their Sunday finest on, and they are, you know, they're looking forward to a great, bright future. And this is how my family came. This is how the relatives of the first of the story that I want to share with you today. I want to talk to you about Elias Cintron, and his grandparents came just like this, with one of these little kids would have been his dad. And I want to tell you Elias's story. So I begin with the story of Elias. Elias Cintron was born in 1984 in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. His father, Rafael Cintron, having tried his bite at the Big Apple and finding it lousy and full of worms, had returned to Puerto Rico alongside his mother, married Father Elias and Elias's sister, and tried to reconnect with his Puerto Rican roots. Elias's father, Rafael, came of age in New York City, completing elementary and middle school before tragedy struck the family. And Elias explains, he says, "My dad's family arrived in New York when he was a little kid. So he did all his school and his teenage years here in New York in the 1970s. His dad was murdered in New York. He was 14 to 15 years old, the son. My grandma was working here in the garment industry. My grandfather was a janitor. He went to Korea, so it's the classic history of Puerto Ricans coming here in the 50s, then cut short by tragedy. They were the kind of family that came in those years that really wanted to work. So they were these people that came and they really wanted to work. And Elias has just told us how his grandfather's murdered by the NYPD, and the family is just devastated. And that trauma stays with the family for generations. The family that came seeking opportunities instead found tragedy that thrust their lives into a tailspin that reverberated across the ocean to Puerto Rico in the next generation. Elias's grandfather was murdered by the NYPD. And within days, Elias's grandmother returned to Puerto Rico with her grieving children in tow to bury her husband's body and her dreams of a better life. And Elias explains, "There's a little mess about it, but I think this is very essential to like my growth. This gets me back to the island and how I am in my relationship to the space in Puerto Rico with my dad, because my grandfather had been beaten by the NYPD. So there was like a lawsuit or something going on. But when my grandfather got murdered and my grandmother went just like drop everything, you know, like I always say they packed up the trauma. Elias identifies this event as one that shaped his father's relationship with Puerto Rico, and in turn, his own identity and relationship to the island. Many Puerto Ricans have suffered similar generational traumas rooted in and produced by circular migration that have resulted in many broken Puerto Rican families. And so Elias is born in Puerto Rico in 1984. He did not feel like he was ever able to acclimate to the Puerto Rican culture. He was instead taught to devalue his native culture while idealizing the American way of life. Although he had returned to Puerto Rico under traumatic circumstances when his own father was murdered, Elias's father held a romanticized view of his time in New York. Elias explains, so then I think this is very important how my dad, as I grew up, I noticed that even though we live in Puerto Rico, he did not grow roots in the town, in the culture, in the Puerto Rican island culture. I guess he was New Yorican, right? We can unpack what we might label as assimilation or Americanization, that aspect of the colonial project. And I get into that in other parts of my dissertation. I do a lot of looking at that. The point is that it is complicated and for many traumatic, because circular migration means there is a going back and forth between the island and the mainland, leaving loved ones behind and trying to forge an identity, make a home and a life. And there's a lot of back and forth. And we continue to see that now with Hurricane Maria and now with Fiona. And so that assimilation, what is Americanization? What is leaving your own culture behind? What is the value of your culture? And, you know, it's still going on. And there are people coming back and forth and back and forth. And that's the circular migration. That's the story of circular migration. So Elias's story gives us a view of what Americanization looks like in both spaces, right? The family comes here, they're racialized, I mean, ultimate, the worst. And then they go back to Puerto Rico and they're not quite able to be in that space. As far as, and by the way, this is the story of Elias. I'm not generalizing. This is not every Puerto Rican, but I heard similar stories about the difficulties of circular migration and making a home. It did emerge as a theme. So as far as Elias's childhood growing up in Puerto Rico, he explained that at home, the family watched only American programming from mainland television stations and listened to the Motown and rhythm and blues hits of Elias's father's adolescence, shunning any Puerto Rican music, television shows, or entertainment. Elias describes how American culture was valued over their own Puerto Rican culture. The father, having been uprooted, first as a child to move to New York during the Great Migration, and then as an adolescent to return to the island, remained rudderless and internalized a colonized mindset. Everything American was superior. In effect, he experienced what sociologist Bob Blauner calls a cultural and psychic penetration of colonialism. He passed that deep sense of Puerto Rican inferiority down to Elias. So I just want to take a pause here because I do want to say that I think things are different now. And I get into that a little bit later on in the presentation, because there is a different level of consciousness and an embracing of Puerto Rican culture and an understanding of coloniality and what it is to be a colonized subject and how to resist that. And we definitely see a lot of that broadly in Puerto Rico now. But Elias is a millennial, and so he's talking about growing up in Puerto Rico in the 1990s, where Americanization was in full effect and everything American was just so seductive and so wonderful, and everybody wanted to speak English and be American, and that was a big thing. So any questions, comments, ideas, reactions?
Can you stop the screen share so I could see the YouTube chat? I can't see it when
Sure.
Okay. So I have some questions about this. About your sharing Elias's story and then the research.
And there's more. I want to move. The next part of his story is he actually comes to America and becomes homeless. So that's the circular part of it. But yeah,
the circularity, to me, I mean, it also says there's a lot of rupture in the continuity of the lives of people, right? Of Puerto Ricans or New Yorkers, the circular process. I mean, one was the the very real sort of history of exploitation of the island that pushed many, as you said, quote unquote, the surplus population, right? It's like there was a surplus population because of the dispossession of much of the land that forced people off the land, right? And of course, and the loss of livelihoods, right? And they became it was a surplus working population, which meant poverty for many people, right?
And it's an allusion to the capitalist system that was
Yeah,
put in. Yeah, right.
certainly. And that's a rupture of course, that's a rupture in the roots that they had. First of all, the dispossession from the land, the loss of livelihoods, economic instability. That's rupture to begin with, of course, that pushed people to come to New York as well. And then the experience, as you said, as a marginalized population, as a racialized population in New York City, led to. My question is, is that the main reason for the ruptures, that pushed people to migrate back to Puerto Rico? Because Elias's story is that, but is that a general pattern you saw, that the
Yeah,
marginalization?
people come back and forth for so many reasons, and it's for good. It's sometimes for great reasons, for wonderful reasons. So everybody that came will not tell the same story, that they were racialized and marginalized and they weren't successful. Many people went to college, and I'm talking to you from my office in the suburbs, and I really assimilated, really assimilated. Assimilated. So everybody doesn't tell the same story. Some people saved enough money and went back and bought. So the immigrant stream. I'm going to go to this country. I'm going to make some money, and I'm going to buy my little home back in my beloved country. And many people do that. And so some people leave because of trauma or because of not making it here. People leave and go back and forth because of divorce or families breaking up. So that people go back and forth for not so great reasons, but they also go back and forth for wonderful reasons. I have a participant that I spoke to, and her parents originally came during the Great Migration and were able to buy a home. And so 2 generations later, this is the home that she's living in now. So if there are good reasons, not only ruptures, but sometimes good reasons for people to come back and forth. And then there's complicated by the extended family, right? So my siblings lived with my father lived in Puerto Rico. My parents divorced, so we were back and forth. But I had siblings that lived with aunts and uncles, and so it's just complicated. There's a lot of reasons why people come back and forth, and it's all the lubricant is that we're citizens, right? So we can come back and forth, and then the reasons why we're doing that vary. Yeah,
Absolutely.
mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Thank you. Also, I just want to define also for our audience, when you say diaspora, so some of our students may not know, diaspora refers to a population that lives away from its place of origin, right? Outside of its place of origin. So the Puerto Rican diaspora are Puerto Ricans who live outside of the island of Puerto Rico. Just to clarify for our audience. Thank you.
And it's become a really important thing because after Hurricane Maria, the diaspora and Puerto Ricans, usually the concentration of Puerto Ricans has been in New York, Boston, Chicago, and Florida. And after Hurricane Maria, there's just way more diffused, and we're all over the country now. But the big populations originally in those places. Okay. Okay. So just to continue with Elias's story, the next part of it is that we were talking about the dad thinking that everything American was just so superior, and going back to Puerto Rico and having been traumatized. The father was traumatized. His father had been murdered. His own father had been murdered, and then he goes to Puerto Rico and he starts his own family, and he has a son and a daughter, and he's just not happy. He's actually drinking. He's suffers from alcoholism, not surprising with that trauma, and he hates Puerto Rico. And we talk about how he passes that sense of inferiority down to Elias. Everything Puerto Rican is inferior, and so in fact, that sense of inferiority would taint Elias's childhood, which would be riddled with instability. Elias recalls becoming homeless at the age of 12 due to his dad's alcoholism, which cracked his psyche. I remember the day, and this is how he describes the day that he becomes homeless. He says, I remember the day they came to the door and my mom is like, listen, we've got to pack and leave today. You know, it was a day's notice. And I think that first that kind of like cracked my illusion of safety. We were homeless and I was not allowed to talk about it. I was sent to my aunt's house and stuff, and it was very traumatic time. And because its core was the alcoholism and the trauma of my dad, and we could not talk about it because of his shame, he made me lie about it, you know? And so I felt like I started at that moment a sort of cognitive dissonance. For Elias, not being able to say the word homeless, let alone process the concept of homelessness, is something that shattered his illusion of safety and set him down the road to drug addiction. At the age of 24, Elias migrated to New York City, following the familiar template of fleeing trauma in the hopes for a fresh start and a better life. But his heroin addiction continued and Elias's life spiraled downward. He eventually reached his lowest point when he nearly lost his life after living underground in Baltimore for 2 years, a period of intense suffering, which he remembers felt more like a million years. While Elias was living under a bridge in Baltimore, he was awoken in the middle of the night by a person that he knew who suffered from severe mental illness and crack addiction, and this person was trying to kill him. The story of Elias's precarious conditions living under a bridge in Baltimore can only and unequivocally be called homelessness. But the vagaries of homelessness is something that came up with several participants during our interviews, begging the question, was homelessness in this unique Puerto Rican context that is blurred by circular migration and the common occurrence of living or temporarily crashing with relatives. And I would say that this is relevant now with the displacement due to Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Fiona, austerity measures that are making Puerto Ricans just leave the island en masse. And so this idea of searching for a home, I would argue, is still very important. When do we say that someone is homeless? You know, look at the if you can see the news of where people are staying after Maria, 5 years later now with Fiona. That's not a whole, you know, they're you know, our definition of what is being unhoused is it needs to be looked at. So not being able to name the conditions that they endured as being homeless or without a home resonated deeply with some participants, whether the homelessness they experienced was due to literally living on the streets or it was the pain of leaving Puerto Rico and not being accepted in the white spaces they encountered. Some of the participants did not name their lack of housing homelessness because their condition was obfuscated by the nature of Puerto Rican circular migration. It is necessary to look at the history of Puerto Rico as a colony of the United States and the treatment of Puerto Ricans as colonial subjects to understand the occurrence and impact of circular migration. So I love telling the stories and I love my research project because I got to just sit with people and I had the luxury of letting them tell me their full story. And so sitting and talking to Elias was a ride. I mean, what a story. And Elias is a very like a wiry and intense and amazing young man. And he tells the story of all this trauma and everything that he went through. And then he talks about what happens when he's ultimately transformed and he has an aha moment. And so for Elias, he describes this aha moment, you know, so a lot of people that I talked to talked about loving. You asked me earlier, is it a rupture, the going back and forth? And for some people, they loved it. They loved that they lived here and they lived there. And then they went back in the summers because they felt like it was a way of keeping in touch and being connected and being rooted in their Puerto Rican identity. And it helped them learn about the history and the culture and to improve their Spanish language skills. And so that ability that Puerto Rican immigrants have, that they can go back and forth. A lot of immigrants, you know, unfortunately don't have that. So some people said that it did enhance how they identify as Puerto Ricans. So Elias describes an aha moment when he came to understand the significance of this circular migration. After learning, he read about the young lords, Jose Chacha Jimenez, the activist and founder of the Young Lords. And he read about the impact that visiting the island had on Chacha Jimenez. And Elias explains, he goes, I articulated this better after reading about the Chacha Jimenez story. He says that he was arrested, and that was right around the time, that was right before the Young Lords are getting started in Chicago. Chacha Jimenez gets arrested, and he got in problems, and the court, as a punishment, sent him to Puerto Rico. And Chacha Jimenez says that in Puerto Rico, on that trip, he met his grandfather that looked like him. This is when Puerto Ricans are finding out that they're African and Taino, and all of these basics. And that's Elias explaining. And then Elias's own ideas about his own Puerto Rican identity would also crystallize as a result of circular migration. Elias, who was born and raised on the island, surprisingly found his Puerto Rican identity and his home in New York City. He explains, the effect that it had is that he, Chacha Jimenez, gained identity and pride and came back more Puerto Rican. And I feel like that happened to me the opposite. I feel like I became Puerto Rican again in New York, by connecting my family's history here. A very big moment for me, and in New York, in the Sures in Williamsburg, now it's kind of like Domino Park, the area where there used to be just a small little park. And I remember actually looking at a mural that El Puente had painted right there. And it had a couple of vejigantes on it. It had Oscar, free Oscar Lopez Rivera. And I remember that's the first thing I really felt part of the city. And it had all these little poems, like little lines of the Puerto Rican poet activist Antonio Cortejer. I know it had a little logo painted with some Young Lords on it, but I did not know that, because finding out the words is also a big transformative moment. Elias explains how finding this representation of Puerto Rican life in this mural on a street in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, helped him make sense of his own family's history and circular migration, and ultimately make it home in a diaspora. And when Elias tells his story, and I'm telling him that he needs to write his own autobiography, and he describes coming from Baltimore, and he had just had that horrific experience where he almost lost his life. And he says, I got to clean up. And he has a friend who says, come and hang out on my couch, come back to New York. And it no longer exists, this mural, but he just is walking, and he's still suffering from heroin addiction, but he sees this vibrant mural, and it has all of these things. It has the poem he's referencing is called Boricua Hasta en la Luna, and it's a poem by Antonio Cortejer, and it says something to the effect of, I would be Puerto Rican even if I was born in the moon, And he's like, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm in New York, but I'm here, my people are here. And so this is the mural, and I have a few more shots of the mural, just really beautiful, vibrant, showing Puerto Rican life in Williamsburg. And there's the vejigante, is the puppet, and all these other references to Puerto Rican life. And of course, the joy of getting the fire hydrant if you've never experienced it, I don't know what to tell you, but this beautiful image of the children playing in the fire hydrant. So
question, could you just define vejigante for us?
Oh, the vejigante is right here, and it is this mask, and the vejigante is used. Do you see the mask with the person with the fire hydrant? Can you see that?
Yes.
And this is from the African heritage of Puerto Ricans, and it is something that is very much seen at folkloric events on the island. And I really, really get into, since it's a Hispanic Heritage Month, we can talk about anti-Blackness and Black erasure, and I get into that. I'm actually writing that chapter now about Puerto Ricans embracing an identity that is a mestizaje, which is a racial triad. Puerto Ricans always say, oh, I'm Hispanic, right? I'm Spanish, that Hispanophilia, that we are the Catholic Church, we speak Spanish, our family values, all these great things that we love, that we say we got, that are directly from our Spanish heritage. But then the racial triad was constructed as discursively constructed to say that Puerto Ricans are this harmonious, beautiful mix of Spaniard, African, and Taino, indigenous, but indigenous people died. They don't exist anymore according to the racial triad. I spoke to many people who are Taino and who live and have always lived as Tainos. So I talk about that. And then the Vejigante is really just an example of how the African heritage is sort of, the scholar Isa Gudro calls it emplacement. It's placed, it's sort of marginalized. Oh, the African communities are around the shorelines. You know, there's a few, there's San Antonio and Ponce, and there's Loíza, and this is where Blackness is. So it's marginalized, it's in place, and it's sort of, it exists, kind of has a folkloric status. There's music and bomba and plena and the Vejigantes, but so there's a lot to it. So the Vejigante is significant. The poetry was significant. The reference on the mural to the young lords was significant. And the free Oscar Lopez was a Puerto Rican activist who was with the FALN, and he was the one that was pardoned by Obama, if you remember. That was so there's a lot being represented in that mural. And we can take a break right after this, because I want to show you this is if it's kind of a long shot. This is where he found the mural. And so we arrive here, and this is a shot of the Domino Sugar Factory in Williamsburg, and the site where Elias finally found himself at home. And it is beyond ironic that it was precisely this site where the American Sugar Refining Trust Company that I talked to you about at the beginning, where they processed the raw sugar that they procured from the sugar plantations they created in the Puerto Rican colony, in a process that dispossessed scores of Puerto Ricans. This is the place where Elias found his home. Elias found a home in a place where he had experienced poverty and homelessness, a place where his grandfather had been murdered, where he had been marginalized, racialized, and oppressed, where he was exploited. Here in the shadows of the Domino Sugar Refinery in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, is where he found his people, his culture, his history, and himself, and he made a home there. And he's a brilliant human being. He's an activist. He works in journalism, and he's just a phenomenal person. And then this is the real last slide before our next thing is, these are other words from my participants about making a home. And the one on the upper right hand says, and then when I finally did start to learn, noticing that people were saying racist remarks to me, and I knew nothing about racism. I didn't know what was happening because I was a kid, and it just baffled me that people were talking to me this way. And this is a participant who identifies as Afro-Boricua, and she talks about when she's on the island, there's not racism like that, there's not colorism like that. And so she's shocked that people are being racist here. And I do unpack what is colorism and what is racism. It does exist, and just, you know, what are the discourses around racism here in the diaspora versus on the island. And then this last one was another participant, and she, about coming back and forth, she comes as a kid. They both come around the same age, around, you know, elementary school, 9-10 years old. And this participant says in the bottom left-hand corner, I didn't go to Puerto Rico at all. Like, I think the last time I had gone growing up was like maybe freshman year of high school. And then like the rest of high school, I was like, I'm a white girl. Like, this is it. This is who I am. It's like, I'm like wondering if I would feel more confident in my Puerto Rican identity if I had visited home more often. I'm from Puerto Rico, so I'm better than them. Like, they're New Yorkers, I'm Puerto Rican. It's just like, I'm like really wondering how different my perspective would be if I had gone home a lot more often. So completely saying two different things. This is a person who is white presenting and identifies as white and has completely, gone for that Americanization process. She came at 10 and she's still here. She's living here, has lived here nonstop since she got here. And on the one hand, she says, I'm a white person, I'm American. I'm not Puerto Rican, I'm American. And then on the other hand says, but wait a minute, I speak Spanish, I know my history, I was born in Puerto Rico, I'm more Puerto Rican than these New Yorkers. So she wants to, claim that Puerto Rican identity to the extent that claim it even more than people who are born in the diaspora, but then relinquishes it and says, I'm white. And so that just encapsulates the difficulties and just the complexities. And I just wanted to check in, and we can do one more thing, but I just want to check in about questions. Or
Yes, there is a question here from Maruja Malave. Would it be different for Puerto Ricans then and now if the island were a state instead of a commonwealth? Would they have felt less marginalized?
So then there's no answering that question, right? Because there is no they. It's a bunch of individual peoples, and so I can't speak to that, and I can't say. The what if, the history about the statehood movement for statehooders is complex also. So I think when you're talking about my participants, if they were statehood, I've seen the argument, and the argument is very, very, very popular now, that if Puerto Rico were a state, it wouldn't be suffering all of this, that FEMA would come and do whatever. I don't know. That's a big, volatile, argument about what would statehood do for Puerto Ricans. Would it end racialization and marginalization? Does it end racialization in the mainland? I referenced Blauner, and he's a scholar from the 1970s, and he actually framed people that are living and being marginalized and racialized, like African Americans and Mexicans and Puerto Ricans that live on the mainland, and he calls it an internal colony. And so this whole idea of subjugating and oppressing what is legal, the legal status of being a state or being a commonwealth, versus how people are treated. I don't know that label, you're a state, is going to make that go away. It's going to solve the problems. I will say that people on the island have the right to determine for themselves what they should be, and that you have to ask. Yeah.
It certainly is an interesting question. I mean, because Italians were racialized, but over generations, particularly Southern Italians were racialized in the United States, and then they weren't considered white, when they first arrived here, in the late 19th century and so on. And over time, over generations, they came to be accepted as white. One of the historians at the Schomburg Center talked about this, and the way the media and the newspapers would write about immigrants early in the 20th century, and how their language about immigrants changed, that is, European immigrants changed in the latter half of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, they would identify immigrants by their place of origin constantly. And that started to change after 1930s or so. I forget the historian from the Schomburg Center who was talking about this, the name, I mean. But saying if you just do a content analysis of newspapers, the way they would talk about European immigrants, that, identifying them as Italians or Polish or something else, disappears after 1930, and they begin to just simply talk about them as people of European descent as Americans. When before there was there was a kind of racialization of certain groups, particularly of Italians and so on. And of course,
I've read a little bit of some about how they are able to be accepted into whiteness and the construction of whiteness, and when that is opened up, when there is access to that, and why that access was granted when that whiteness needed to be protected. So there's a lot written about that, and why Europeans, Southern Europeans, Italians get to be white, and people like Puerto Ricans do not get to be white. And I actually interview people who are white presenting Puerto Ricans, and they don't get to be white. They don't get to be white. They open their mouths and their accent or whatever. And so I think that's a really huge topic. Who gets to be white, and how did whiteness get conferred, and for what reasons? What were the, how did that benefit, who did it benefit, and how? Why was it deployed? Why were people embraced and allowed to enter into that?
I just want to share another comment from Jasmine Floyd, a student at our college. I also feel disconnected from my home origins, and I feel I would feel more connected with myself if I was able to spend long periods of time there, I think Puerto Rico, I know she had mentioned earlier that she's part Puerto Rican descent. They're absorbing the culture and lifestyle of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, not always negative, actually positive. People want to go back, so I don't want to mislead by saying trauma and people went back, because I give you an example of trauma being the what's pushing people back and forth. And I interviewed 15 people, and I have 15 stories, and I could have shared a lot. And I hope that my choice of sharing something with it that has a lot of trauma isn't misleading. And I explained that I did that because my participants said we have to go through it. If you want to talk about liberation, we have to go through this trauma. We have to heal, and it just kept coming up. And so that's why I'm sharing it. I don't want to add to the to the narrative of this culture of poverty or this just very dysfunctional lives. I don't want to add to that. I just want to amplify that some of those experiences, as my participants are sharing them, and as we're seeing in the news and as we're seeing everywhere, have to do with the colonial status. So that's a good segue to my next piece. And you know what I do? I'll just go ahead and show the video first, and then give some parting comments. So all right, I'm gonna just play a video first, and then let me explain this little, you referenced Bad Bunny. So I just want to say that a few weeks ago, if you guys are watching social media and the news, the Puerto Ricans were protesting in the streets against Luma Energy. Puerto Ricans of all ages protest as they reel from the abuse they have endured in the aftermath of an enduring financial crisis and the imposition of the Promesa Fiscal Control Board in 2016. That the US Congress and then the resulting austerity measures, the psychological and material ravages of Hurricane Maria and neoliberal schemes which have led to school closures and the privatizations of public goods and services are being protested. In 2020, the contract to modernize and maintain Puerto Rico's electric grid was given to an ineffective and much reviled Canadian Houston-based joint venture called Luma Energy. And you always hear Luma pa'l carajo, and that's the Luma that you're hearing. In the years since the privatization, widespread power outages have literally plunged Puerto Ricans into darkness and despair, with electric bills tripling even as power outages increase and wreak havoc in hospitals and homes across the island. So social media has been pretty integral in galvanizing protest movements globally, but especially in Puerto Rico. And recently, Puerto Rican musician and political activist Bad Bunny insisted that his concert be broadcast for free throughout the island. And he commiserated with fellow Puerto Ricans when he used his global platform to call out Luma and corrupt politicians, exhorting that Luma and Puerto Rican Governor Pedro Pierluisi needed to go pa'l carajo. That's to hell. This reminded me of a meme of Bad Bunny that surfaced last year, which I'm sharing here, that says, theory, Bad Bunny is in reality Antonio Gramsci, who time traveled because he understands that the erosion of the bourgeoisie is achievable through reggaeton. And Gramsci was an Italian philosopher and a Marxist who developed the theory of cultural hegemony, or explaining how the bourgeoisie, the capitalist ruling class, uses cultural institutions to legitimize and maintain hegemonic control. So it is evident that consciousness raising, historizing, and theorizing is happening among groups of Puerto Ricans outside of traditional institutions. The energy and urgency is palpable, and this energy was palpable among the participants that I interviewed. And regardless of whether they live on the island or the diaspora, participants are very much connected to the events unfolding. And on that note, I just wanted to share with you, I'm pretty sure we've all seen the video, but I just want to play about 5 minutes of it. And it's just really beautiful visuals.
Famosita carta de los 30 días y toma y te tienes que ir. ¿Y ahora para dónde cojo? Y si lo que me cobran...
Porque al final no hay orgullo cambio más grande que logro decir, yo soy de P. Mucho cariño para todos ustedes.
Puerto Rico está bien cabrón, ey, está bien cabrón. De Carolina sale el reggaetón y los hijueputas de Bayamón, ey, ey. Quieren montarse en la ola y no han ido a Rincón. Un besito pa' abuela en el balcón cogiendo todos los hoyos en la Rubicón. P fucking R, ey. Tierra de Maelo y Teo Calderón y de Barea, el que fue campeón. Primero que LeBron.
Puerto Rico sigue sufriendo apagones que dejan a decenas de miles sin luz. Esta explosión dejó a todo Puerto Rico a oscuras en abril. En agosto, uno de los hospitales principales del país estuvo casi 20 horas sin electricidad. Todo esto después de que la distribución de energía en Puerto Rico pasara a manos de una compañía privada. El gobierno le otorgó un contrato multimillonario a una compañía de Estados Unidos y Canadá llamada Luma Energy, y le prometieron al pueblo que el servicio sería mejor. Pero según las métricas del mismo gobierno, ahora los apagones son más largos. El resultado es estudiantes que hacen sus asignaciones a oscuras, en seres dañados y personas que no pueden conectar su equipo médico en casa. A la vez, el pueblo puertorriqueño ha visto 7 aumentos consecutivos en la factura de luz, mientras que los ejecutivos de Luma cobran salarios nunca antes vistos en la Corporación Eléctrica de Puerto Rico. Y hay gente que está perdiendo la paciencia y protestando en las calles.
Maldita sea, otro apagón, vamos para los bleachers a prender un blon. Antes que a Pipo le dé un bofetón, Puerto Rico está en cabrón, ey, estoy en cabrón, Puerto Rico está en cabrón, ey, ey, pichea Maldiva, yo me quedo en Palomino, ey, si no me voy para redes, un saludo a mis vecinos, ey, aquí el calor es diferente, el sol está ahí, no, ey, la capital del perreo, ahora todos quieren ser latinos, no, ey, pero le falta sazón, batería y reggaetón, ey, ey, cuido con mi corillo que somos un montón, ey, ey, le falta sazón, batería y reggaetón, ey, ey, cuido con mi corillo que somos un montón, welcome to the palentón.
Yo creo que el público sabe que esto es una cosa más o menos informal.
Yo no me quiero ir de aquí, no me quiero ir de aquí. Que se vayan ellos, que se vayan ellos, que se vayan ellos, que se vayan ellos. Lo que me pertenece a mí, se lo quedan ellos, que se vayan ellos. Esta es mi playa, este es mi sol, esta es mi tierra. Esta soy yo, esta es mi playa, este es mi sol, esta es mi tierra, esta soy yo.
Que están desplazando al boricua nativo de aquí. Ajá. Con la famosita carta de los 30 días y toma y te tienes que ir. ¿Y ahora para dónde cojo? Y si lo que me cobran allí donde yo puedo no me va a dar con lo que yo me gano.
Lo que pasa es que lo que hay es unos grandes intereses aquí.
Y está pasando en Puerto Rico completo.
Y vamos a ser extranjeros en nuestra propia patria.
Tenemos que movernos, dama.
Okay, so hopefully you've seen the video. If you haven't, there's about another 20 minutes, but it's fascinating how he lays it all out there. He talks about gentrification and corruption of the government, neoliberalism, and how Puerto Ricans are being dispossessed. He features Bianca Gralu, who's a journalist, very prominently in the middle of the video. So he has such a massive platform, and he's really just doing a lot of work there, and then attaching a documentary that goes into great detail about the displacement through gentrification and neoliberal schemes that is killing us. It's killing Puerto Rico. And so I hope this all made sense. I feel like it was a lot. I wanted to give you some more background on the more up-to-date history with the austerity measures and what happened, but we don't have the time. And I just wanted to offer up one story of many to kind of.
I think it certainly the presentation was fascinating, and I think it generates a lot of questions, to ask about the experience of being from more than one place at the same time, right? And the impact of that psychologically, emotionally on people, the challenges of that, and moving back and forth, and in some respects, resiliency, right? I think it speaks to the resiliency of people in the struggle to survive under very difficult. I think the Bad Bunny video reflected that, right? I mean, the beginning is like showing the difficulties of Puerto Rico, but then it moves to the part where they're like, Puerto Rico's where they're partying and they're having a good time. So amidst that struggle, they're also finding joy, right? That they're able to find joy even amidst that struggle. I mean, that Puerto Rico is a special place where they can find joy even within the struggle. I think I like that aspect of that story about resiliency at the same time. So I just wanted to share a little bit of what some students had writing here on the chat. Jasmine Floyd continued and pointed out, my grandfather lived in Puerto Rico for years, and when he came to New York, he often asked why we did certain things and enjoyed certain foods, and used to tell us about life back home. Since he's passed, I felt even more disconnected as I don't have a daily reminder anymore. That's kind of interesting, right? I mean, people connect us, right? Do you want to comment on that, or?
Yeah, it's sad, and some people, and you reference other immigrant groups, and the fact that some people do assimilate and let go of those connections. And then what's different about Puerto Ricans, and it's strengthened because we can go back and forth, and those ties remain strong. But after Hurricane Maria, if you had, Puerto Ricans just like, in the diaspora would just like, completely in charged up because of what was happening, because it's the humanitarian, even if you're not Puerto Rican, just to see the suffering on a humanitarian level, but the fact that it was our grandmothers and our cousins and whatever. And so it really sparks something, and that spark that we see in many places is something that kind of unites us. And I can imagine that the person that is speaking, that they're missing that connection of their grandfather. I'm sure when they look at Bad Bunny or when they look at anything else, they got to have that little feeling of, so hold on to that and nurture it, which is what we're saying, and what we get to do with Hispanic Heritage Month is to have these conversations, but also to understand that everybody has a story, and that we want to listen to stories from other people all over, who also have similar stories of struggle, and to find commonality. And whether for Puerto Ricans that commonality is with other Latino countries, great, but it's also with other countries globally that may or may not be also Spanish or former Spanish colonies. We have a lot in common, and there's a lot of work to do, but being able to hear each other's stories and to construct meaning for ourselves, to empower ourselves.
And it's just connection to a place. A place also is people, right? I mean, that connection is really through people. So when we think of place, we're often thinking about the people who are associated with that place. Samantha Cruz was really happy to see the video. Yes, Bad Bunny, El Apagón. She says she loved that song.
Mhm, mhm.
Um,
I mean, we
so
could literally have just sat here. And it's so informative. We could have just, and it would have been well worth our time.
I just have a question about, as you said, liberatory educational experiences. Um, could you speak a little bit, I think, from Elias's story where he has that moment of awakening. Uh,
Mhm.
can you explain a little more about that,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
liberatory educational
yeah, I
experience?
could tie that all together because so I'm getting a PhD in the urban ed program. So it has to do with education. And so ultimately it's like, how can we improve and public education, right? We have a commitment to critical scholarship to help public education. And so what does this have to do with public education? And when I started the my program there, I was very much interested in Puerto Rican activism. I knew people in the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. I know activists and stuff. And I started the program in 2018. I had already applied before Maria. I was applying as Maria happened. I had already decided to apply, but then, Hurricane Maria just galvanized us and made us all like, so for me, I had a real passion. What can I do? How can I serve? And for me, it was always, what can I do to help Puerto Ricans? And liberatory educational experiences, I have this colonial residue. I'm so colonized. I was like, I thought that I would find pedagogies, like culturally sustaining pedagogies, or maybe mentors or programs. So I was like, what are the programs? What are the policies? What are the pedagogies where Puerto Ricans feel empowered? And maybe where anybody would feel empowered, but I was going to interview Puerto Ricans to find that out. And the people that I talked to, I used a grounded theory. So I didn't have anything other than I want to know. And I had some questions, but didn't have a theory. I didn't think, it was culturally sustaining pedagogies. I was just like, I'm going to let people tell me. And I had the luxury of using oral history. So I can just sit back and listen to stories and then construct meaning and take it from there. And the stories that people told me were about trauma a lot. And I was like, shit, I don't want to talk about trauma. I don't want to serve up trauma porn. But the stories were trauma, and they were trauma because of colonial status. And then people say, everybody was talking about coloniality and a colonial status. Yes, because everybody knows, because after Hurricane Maria, and people were asking themselves, how are we so mistreated? Why? What's going on? What is going on? And so there's a very high understanding of Puerto Rico being a colony and what that means. And for the participants, the liberatory educational liberation comes from freeing ourselves from oppression, and so Elias's story of self-knowledge. And so for the participant, for my research, the conclusions, which I'm working at and I'm writing about now, liberation and liberatory educational experiences happen in all kinds of spaces. For Elias, it happened on a street in Brooklyn. For other participants, it happened in a Taino indigenous group in upstate New York that they joined, where they were validated. They always said they were Taino. They were raised going to areitos, and they had an identity of being Taino, and they were told, no, the Tainos died. You're not a Taino. Were you? And for them, liberation came from joining these people and joining a tribe and understanding and learning more. So liberatory educational experiences are happening in different spaces. And for my participants, a lot of it has to do with decolonizing education. And I get into what that means. How do you decolonize? Because that's really sexy. Oh, decolonize. What does that mean? And my participants had some very specific ideas about what decolonizing education and what liberatory educational experiences are and were for them. So, yeah.
It seems like, yeah, the opportunity to tell stories and tell their own story, when often that story was erased, right? Right. I mean, the fact,
Precisely.
our argument that Tainos don't exist is a kind of an erasure of the history of Taino peoples, right?
Right.
And so the ability to discover that story is not accurate, to fill in that story through the exploration is kind of liberating, I would say, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and it gives meaning to people's existence to say, look, there's a reason why I'm here. I fit in this world in some way. There's a place for me in this world is powerful, right? And I think for students is that when they don't feel that, how can they learn, right?
Exactly. So then what do we do in our classroom spaces? What do we do in pre-K and kindergarten and sixth grade? What do we do in undergrad and graduate? What do we do in our classroom spaces so that it's about students? It's completely about students.
Yes, yeah, so thank you. That was, that last point I think you're making is a very powerful one, and thank you. We are a little over time, so I'm sorry, but it was
No
a very
problem.
fascinating conversation. And
Thank
we did start a
you.
little late because of technical difficulty, so in
Yes.
effect,
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to your community for spending time. I wish I could see you. I wish we could have a conversation because that's that. But I really, really appreciate you all joining us on a Thursday night. And thank you so much.
I
Yeah.
wish we could continue the conversation. It was a really interesting one, and share more of the stories that you were able to collect. I would, love to hear more about that. So thank you again, Daicy Diaz-Granado, researcher, doctoral candidate at the City University of New York Graduate Center, sharing her research and fascinating research with us, oral histories, with an eye on thinking more broadly about educational experiences. Um, so very good. Jasmine Floyd says thank you to you.
Thank you.
So I just before closing tonight, I want to remind people of our upcoming event next Wednesday, October 5th. Again, a live stream event in the evening from 7 to 8:15 p.m. It's an evening of poetry and conversation with Deborah Paredes. Deborah Paredes is a scholar of ethnic studies and currently a professor at Columbia University. And she's a public intellectual, and she'll share some of her writings with us, her poetry with us, and hopefully have a conversation, which I think will be, I think, very fascinating. So please join us again next Wednesday for an enlightening evening as we had one tonight. So thank you again.
Thank you. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night to everybody.
Be well.
Hope to see you soon. Thanks. Bye.